On behalf of Lewis Academy Now and the Thomas Jefferson Alumni Action Group, or TJAG, thank you for joining us and welcome to the See It, Be It speaker series. Lewis Academy Now and TJAG are thrilled to present this programming together as two organizations striving towards equity in education here in Fairfax County and beyond. TJAG is a group of more than 1,000 TJ alumni that seek to enhance accessibility, inclusion, and innovation within STEM education in order to develop well-rounded and ethical 21st century leaders. Lewis Academy Now represents hundreds of community members, parents, and students, and is an independent organization formed to bring an academy for public policy, government, and human rights to Fairfax County's John R. Lewis High School. Academies in Fairfax County public high schools offer specialized courses that combine academic and career preparation. The Lewis Academy would be an apolitical program designed to encourage civic engagement and develop student awareness of the processes of change through various forms of federal, state, and local government. But enough about us. Let's meet Delegate Keam. Tonight's conversation will be available in English and Spanish. To hear the Spanish interpreter, look for the globe icon along your bottom menu and select your preferred language. We will be recording tonight's discussion, and though your fellow audience members won't be visible, your questions will be recorded as well. In addition, you'll want a smartphone or similar device handy towards the end so you can join in the game of Kahoot, which will be explained later. So without further ado, please welcome TJAG's Akshay Devarakonda of the See It, Be It speaker series. Thank you, and Akshay?
Thank you, Esther, for the introduction, and also thank you to Norma Margulies, who is doing Spanish translation. And Delegate Keam, welcome to the See It, Be It speaker series. To give you a little bit of introduction, you are a lawyer and also a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. You are the first Asian-born immigrant elected to statewide office in Virginia, and also the first Korean-American member of the House of Delegates. And welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Yes, thank you so much. It's good to see you.
And so first off, I just want to start out, I just want to ask how you and your family and your loved ones are doing, just given everything in the past year.
Well, thank you for asking. And let me also start by thanking all the organizers. I know many of you have been involved behind the scenes in hosting this speaker series. I'm honored to be invited to this, but I've also been able to see some of the other previous speakers, including my colleague in the House. And so I want to thank Esther and Makia and others who've organized this. My family, relatively speaking, are doing fine. We are now finally vaccinated, so we feel better about us not being a part of the problem anymore, part of the solution. I also have been, for a lot of reasons, just been able to take, lemon and make it into lemonade. And so we've been able to spend time together as a family a lot more than we normally would have, because I'm home now all the time. So we've been okay.
Cool. I'm really glad to hear that. And definitely congratulations to you on getting the vaccine. And we wanted to talk with you because you have a really inspiring story that we want to share with students in the Northern Virginia area. And to start off with, may I ask you, I guess, to ask you about where you were born and how you grew up. What was your childhood like?
Well, sure. Thank you. I'll keep it short because I don't think my story is any more or less interesting than anybody else's, but we all have our own origin stories and how we ended up in the jobs or positions that we hold now. My story starts in 1966 in Seoul, Korea, which at that time was still pretty much a war-torn nation, just 15 years or so after the war was over. And so I was born in a pretty desolated part of the country. It was a capital city, but it was still pretty much devastated from the war. My mother, who survived the war and in fact survived Japanese imperialism before that and a lot of other personal issues. So she lost both of her parents before and during the war. She had me as a third of the three children, so I was a baby. And my father, at the time I was born, was overseas. He was actually part of the Korean military who was stationed in Vietnam. And so eventually when he came back after being discharged from the army, the five of us as a family decided that we would try something different. And so we started our immigrant journey in 1970 by going back to Vietnam, where my father had been stationed as a military. Now, most people that join the military end up in the Army or the Navy or whichever it is, but it's in the combat side. My father was actually one of the few people that did not carry a firearm. He was carrying a Bible instead because he was a chaplain. And so he was a missionary slash minister in the military. So we went back to Vietnam mainly because my father had spent some time in Vietnam, learning about the culture and the history and the language of Vietnam. And so when there was a bit of a ceasefire, Korea and Vietnam established a relationship diplomatically. And the Korean government asked if my father would go back to Vietnam and try to set up some kind of a community network for the Koreans that were there, both military and business people and others. And so that was how our immigrant life story started. I was 4 years old, lived there for about 5 years. And when I was 9, I still remember this as if it happened just a couple of days ago, even though it was almost 50 years ago, not 45 years ago. Late April, around this time of 1975, Vietnam fell to communism and Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City. And my family, my mother, sister, brother, and I were, well, my mother tells me we ended up on the last commercial flight that left the airport, just in time before the communists took over. My father was not so lucky. He stayed behind thinking that he had a congregation to take care of at church. And he also thought, he knows some people in the government and what have you, he'll be fine. Well, it turned out that he wasn't fine. The communists arrested him, put him away for about a year or so behind the labor camps. And eventually they released him as part of a lot of negotiations to get all the foreigners out of the country. But for that 1 year, when I was 9 until about 10, we went back to Korea, where I was born. And it was a very difficult time because we weren't sure if our father had actually survived or not. There was no news. I mean, there was literally no news out of Vietnam. So we just assumed he was gone. Eventually, we were reunited, and then that led us to live in Australia for a little bit and then to the US. And so my childhood and where I am today is a product of governments and people having to deal with changes in society, and people like us end up being, unfortunate victims of whatever decisions are made by others.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing all that. And it must have been an incredible relief for you and your family to see your father again after that year when he was away. And
Yeah, it was interesting, but on the other hand, I think I gained two things from that experience as a child, which has, for some reason or another, inspired and or maintained what I do today. One is that your family, as important as we are to each other, biological family, uh, they may be there, they may not be. There are circumstances, and we know of so many families who, for a lot of reasons, don't have their fathers or their mothers or their siblings, or a lot of families who because of poverty or other reasons are left to adoption and foster families. And so for me, the idea of family has never been just about a biological or legal relationship. It's about what you make with each other. So human beings coming together and embracing each other and loving each other and creating that relationship, that forms the family unit. So I have a loose definition of what family is, even though I'm honored to have my own children today. I think of a lot of friends and others in my circle as part of my family. But the other is that we really can't determine what happens in our future. And none of us as individuals have the ability to control our fates. But whatever happens, whatever circumstances you end up facing, there are some skills and tools and some personal motivation and determination that can help you through those crises. And adversity tends to build, as people say, it tends to build character, but you have to have the character first before you can build that adversity and be ready for that too. So I think from an early childhood, I realized that we have to be resilient and be strong and not to let anything just devastate us, because it's too easy to just give up and walk away, but you have to find something inside of you that'll keep you going.
absolutely. What skills or tools helped you through that time when you and your family were going through so much?
I think part of it is just that inspiration I saw in my mother, and she is to this day my biggest hero, my heroine, and she is somebody who, even though she never had a formal education, growing up in Korea during the war, she was not able to receive much of an education, and she ended up becoming orphaned pretty early because her parents
Mm-hmm.
passed away. And also, could you imagine being a woman in Asia in the 1960s and 70s? You just didn't have the kind of rights that we take for granted now in Western society. And so she struggled a lot. But even though she is not what you might consider to be a highly educated person in American standards, nor sophisticated, she barely speaks English and she barely understands most of the modern society. She is still, to me, the wisest person, the most intelligent person, and the strongest human
Mm.
being I know. She survives, and she just kind of lets things just roll over off her shoulder and says, look, this isn't the worst thing. I can live today. I can feed myself. I can feed my kids. I'm going to survive today, and I'm just going to keep going forward. And so I think a lot of immigrants tend to have that sense of motivation and determination, but I've been just amazed by her grit and her determination, and so that keeps me going, knowing that I have some of that in me. Maybe one day it'll show up, maybe, but knowing that I have her DNA helps me have some confidence.
She sounds like a really inspiring person, and thank you for sharing a little bit of her with us.
Mhm.
And so after you said you and your family went to Australia, from there, how did you find your way to America?
Well, it's not a long story, but I'll just tell you a quick version of it.
Mhm.
Most people in the world, I assume, if they had a choice, if they had a chance to go to any other country other than wherever they're born, will probably at least consider America as an option, just because it is such a beacon of hope and the shining city on the hill, and everything that we hear about America being a place of hope and dreams and such. I think in the back of all of our minds, America was always that destination if we were so lucky to get here.
Mhm.
My mother did have an older brother who was separated from her during the war, but he ended up somehow coming to America early on in the 1950s. And so, as a foreign student, and so he settled himself here in New York. And eventually, my mother wanted to join him, but there was just no easy path to do that, immigration or otherwise. And so, eventually, after about 30 odd years of trying, I guess some route was opened up for us, and so we eventually came to America. We settled in California because, coming from the from Asia, Pacific coast is really the easier route. And so we settled in Los Angeles area where a lot of Korean immigrants were. And I think our parents had some connections through friends and relatives. So
Mhm.
in California. And I've lived in California, went to high school, college, and eventually grad school as well. And then I came to the East Coast about 26 years ago. Actually, I first came to Virginia in 1988 to do an internship in Washington, D.C. I fell in love with it. I live in Falls Church, and I just loved everything about Virginia, the history, the traditions here, the understanding of the interest in government and politics. And so I thought maybe one day I'd like to come back and work here. And so I went back, got my grad degree, and then eventually I came back here, and I've been here longer than anywhere else in the world.
Mhm. And so coming to America as a teenage immigrant, and then what was it like, I guess, for you going to high school then? What were your like favorite, what was the experiences like? What were your favorite like subjects or activities then?
Well, so most immigrants, and I guess I'm trying to be a little bit more general than I should be, but most immigrants tend to leave one country and come to America, and so you
Mhm.
basically have two cultures to compare, right? Your homeland and your home culture, and then the new country
Sure.
and the new culture. In my case, I
Mhm.
had that three different times, Korea, Vietnam, Australia, and then the United States, and so I had a number of different ways to compare and contrast. And I think the one thing about America that I always admired from afar was just this sense of freedom, individual liberty. You watch TV shows like Happy or whatever it was
Mhm.
growing up. You just see a bunch of teenagers having fun and going to getting milkshake and stuff like that. Just the iconic American lifestyle of a teenager. And so seeing that in real life was a bit of a kick. I grew up in Southern California. In fact, it was right around the time, you're too young to remember this, but maybe some of our audience might recall. There was a pretty famous movie, which has now become cult status, called Fast Times at Ridgemont High, with Sean Penn. I think it was his first movie, one of his
Mhm.
breakthrough roles. That was filmed in a shopping center, shopping mall, just down the street from where I went to middle school in
Mhm.
San Fernando Valley. And so the whole the concept of the Valley Girl, the dude, like gag me with a spoon, all that stuff. That was the real popular thing happening in the early '80s, and I just happened to be there. And so all these kids that I knew growing up spoke like that, talked like that. They're the surfer dudes, and they're all, wore the same clothes. And I'm thinking, this is really funny. That's how America was, and there they are. The kids
Hmm.
that I was hanging out with were just like that. Uh, and then, of course, coming to the East Coast, I realized that West Coast and East Coast cultures are very, very different. So even if it's the same country, you have such different regional, geographic, language. I mean, just so many different aspects are different. But I think that's what I love about America. I mean, more than anything else about this country. I mean, there's so many things about being an American that I love. Um, Clearly, there's so many aspects of it that, for all the negatives that we can talk about later, there are also some
Yeah.
very strong positives. And the thing that I love the most about it is that we, by and large, we let people be who they are, and that individualism, that sense of authenticity, that allows people to just live, as long as you're not inhibiting other people's rights and infringing on other, aspects of other people's lives. The idea that you can kind of dress however way you want, be however way you want. I like that part of it, and I think Southern California tends to exemplify that lifestyle.
Hmm. And so when you met, because you mentioned you went to college in Southern California as well, which school did you go to?
Oh, I went to school. It's a part of the University of California system called Irvine, which is
Yeah.
now more known than it was when I went there back in the 1980s. When I went, it was my local college. In fact, I applied to one college and I got into one college. I didn't realize you can apply to more than one college, because I'd only been in the US a couple of years when I applied for college, and I just assumed you go to the local college. And it turns
Hmm.
out that I guess I could have applied to more than one, but it was the one that was 30 miles from where I was living. And uh, what was interesting about that school, and I didn't realize this until years later when I look back on it, Irvine and Orange County in that area is a very conservative, politically conservative area. In fact, it still
Yeah.
is. Newport News, Huntington Beach. In fact, I just saw about 2 weeks ago, there was a white supremacist rally in Huntington Beach, which is just down the street from where I grew up in high school. Yeah, so there's,
Hmm.
even though it's Southern California, there's still quite a bit of conservative activism happening there. So when I was at an undergraduate at UCI, and I was a political science major. I was pretty active on campus. I did a lot of community organizing, student body, Asian American students, and multicultural organizations, working with our minority students and such. I realized I was pretty liberal, pretty progressive, and I seemed to kind of be outside of the mainstream campus, even though colleges generally are known to be more liberal. At least Irvine, it was pretty conservative. It's a very wealthy part of very white, very wealthy part of California, and so I found myself
Hmm.
being on the progressive end. And
Hmm.
then a few years later, when I went to law school up in San Francisco, I went to another University of California campus called Hastings College of Law,
Hmm.
which, by the way, Kamala Harris is an alumni, so I'm very proud of
Okay.
that.
That's a great
But
connection.
yeah, when I went to Hastings in downtown San Francisco, I hadn't changed at all, but I found myself being one of the more moderate, if not conservative, students on campus, because California's, northern versus southern California is so different politically, and so San Francisco is extremely, extremely progressive, and so I found myself being more on the conservative side, even though philosophically or politically I hadn't changed. And then eventually, when I moved to Virginia for my job, and I've been here for 20 odd years, I found myself being right in the middle. And so even though I haven't changed, depending on where I lived, I was either too progressive, too conservative, or just right. So I guess it's an interesting way of looking at how different parts of our country have different politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like your education was a really transformative experience for you to help you identify your own values and help you grow as a person.
Mhm.
You had mentioned that I think towards the tail end of your college experience that you had a political internship in DC. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, it was a fantastic program. They called it the UCDC, University of California, District of
Mm,
Columbia, and I believe it's still happening, and I'm sure it's still an ongoing program. So the various campuses of the University of California undergraduates would select students that want to come to Washington D.C. And it's normally a summer thing, but I actually did a spring semester, a spring quarter. But they would come here, find an internship on wherever, Capitol Hill, whatever organizations, nonprofit, think tanks, campaigns, and they would live with them, with each other, and go through programs together. And it wasn't a paid, well, at least when I did it, it wasn't a paid internship. We paid out of our pockets, but we did some fundraising
mhm,
with our airfare and such. But that was my first exposure to Washington, D.C., national politics. I did some independent study while I was here, because I was still taking classes at school. And I focused on campaigns, and that was in the 1988 campaign cycle. I ended up working at the Democratic National Headquarters. Eventually, I was hired by the DNC to work at the convention in Atlanta in 1988, where I got to meet Michael Dukakis, who was a nominee, and working on that campaign for a while. But that experience really opened up my thinking way beyond just the academic aspects of studying political science. I was on campus pretty active with campaigns and organizing. I was a grassroots guy. I was an immigrant rights person. So I did a lot of things on campus involved in a number of organizations. But when you come to Washington, D.C. and you're walking through the marble halls of Congress, it's a whole different caliber of activism and organizing. After spending several months here as an intern and then being hired to work at the Democratic Convention in Atlanta and then traveling and doing some work along the way, I came to two conclusions from that experience. One is Washington, D.C. is in fact the place that has the most amount of influence, not only in the United States, but in the world in terms of influential people coming together, making policies that impact people's lives, changing the lives of so many people. In fact, going back to history, the reason why Saigon fell to communism in April of 1975, and the reason why my family was directly impacted by that, along with millions of other Vietnamese and others and Americans, of course, who lost their lives, and a lot of the refugees and others that were, and then the whole Indochina and the domino theory that it was all generated. All that happened because of the fight between Richard Nixon, the outgoing president, and his scandals with Watergate, and the Democratic Congress that came in the class of '74, who said, you know what, we got to stop everything that Richard Nixon did, including the war, and let's have a clean slate. And so that was one of the reasons why, even though the boots on the ground in Vietnam were asking for more resources, more money, and more arms and such, Congress decided to end that war. And so that had a direct impact on me. I didn't realize that, in 1980s, 40 years after the fact, I realized how much a decision made by a member of Congress or a senator can in fact change the course of the world. And, of course, now we know President Biden was and the war in the Middle East after 20 years, the longest war that we've ever had. Iraq, Afghanistan has become something of a quagmire, as Vietnam had become. And so the decisions that people make in that building in Washington, D.C. has impacts way beyond that city. So I learned how important government can be as a force of either good or bad, depending on who's in that job. The second thing I recognize, though, and this is in the 1980s, so if you think about it, the demographics, the entire time I was in Washington, the entire time I was in Atlanta, I did not meet a single other person who looked like me. And if I did so, if I saw somebody that had an East Asian type of appearance, they were either people that worked at a sandwich shop or a grocery or maybe in a laundromat in downtown DC, or they were Japanese American, third generation, fourth generation, like Senator Danny Inouye or Congressman Bob Matsui or Congressman Norm Mineta and others who I revered, I looked up to, but they were way more American than I was because they were third, fourth generation Americans. And so what I realized is, even though Washington, D.C. and our political process is so vital and so critical to how it influences the world's politics and history, there are so few people of my background, my ethnicity, my immigrant history, who have a role in that. How in the world can I personally work there, let alone how can our government really reflect our views if it's not made up of people that have my life experiences? So I thought, one day I'd like to go back and work in that field. I mean, as a kind of a pipe dream, I'm thinking, yeah, maybe one day I'd like to work there. Little did I know when I left here in 1988 that almost, I guess, I can't do math, but in 2001, however long it was since then, I ended up working on Capitol Hill, and I ended up being chief counsel to a gentleman who I adore. One of my heroes is Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. He's number 2 senator now, has been there for a while. But I ended up being the chief counsel, and I ended up working on a lot of things, including that Iraq war authorization, which my boss voted against. And so I had a chance to work in that building that I was an intern in, 20 years before that, and seeing our government close up. And then now, 40 years after that time, I'm now in another building that's similar looking, a white marble building in Richmond, actually not just supporting and staffing a person who's writing the laws, but actually writing the laws myself. And so for young people out there, if I can do it, anybody can do this job. And so just keep yourselves motivated and aspire to something big for yourself. Because I think if you have the will, there is a way to get there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And even I definitely empathize with your experience with your DC program because I did a similar one when I was at William Mary, and it took a semester to work in DC for an internship there. And I definitely recognize how powerful that experience can be. And so, what was it like for you when you first ran for office in 2009?
Well, it was interesting because I mean, frankly, I never thought about me running for office myself. When you work in politics, inevitably people ask you, "Hey, you should run for something," or you're pretty good at this. Why don't you do this? Whatever. I just always dismissed that, frankly, because I said, "No, no, there's plenty of really smart people out there that are very talented. They deserve to be in the limelight. I love just being in the background." I was a staffer to a couple of elected officials. I was in the Clinton administration. I was in the political appointed job. I've been in campaigns. I ended up running President Obama's first campaign in 2008 in Fairfax County. I was his chairman for the campaign here, and I've been involved in dozens of other political campaigns. And
Hmm.
so I've always enjoyed just kind of being in the background and just working from as a grassroots, as an organizer, as an advisor. Never thought that I would be the one whose name is on the ballot. But I also spent a lot of time in the last 40 odd years working within our communities, immigrant communities, minority communities, especially with Asian Americans in my area. And my message has always been to young and old alike, this government only works if we participate. I mean, I'm
Absolutely.
old fashioned. I still believe in the idea of government of, for, and by the people. And if we want this
Absolutely.
government
Yeah.
to be about we the people,
Hmm.
it means all of us. Even if we weren't here in 1776. The fact is, the concept behind the ideals that Thomas Jefferson wrote and James Madison codified, that ideal includes people like us, as well as women, as well as African Americans who were not part of that history in 1776. And so my message has always been, whether you run for office, whether you donate to a candidate, whether you knock on doors, whether you vote, whatever you do, participate and make this government your own, because it is about us. And so, having said that for 30 odd years, encouraging people to get involved, when people said, you should run, I kept on saying, nah, but it's not about me. I can't do it. So one day I said, if I keep telling people that I'm not going to do it because I'm too chicken, but you should do it, maybe I'm being a little bit hypocritical. So I said, at a minimum, I should at least give it a try just to say I've done it. And whether I win or lose, I should at least be able to say I've worked in just about every aspect of politics and campaigns. And so maybe this is one thing I should try to do. In 2009, what happened was 2008. As I mentioned, both 2007 and 2008, I had been working on the Obama campaign. I got to know President Obama when he was a state senator from Illinois, and so I got to be pretty good friends.
Cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a
Hmm.
funny story, but remember, he was a state senator in Illinois. And
Hmm.
even though I had no connections to Illinois, I was working for the senior senator from Illinois, U.S. senator. And
Hmm.
so when Obama would come to Washington, we'd hang out in our offices. And so I got to know him that way. And so eventually, when he became a U.S. senator, we worked very closely together for a couple of years. And so by the time he decided to run for president, I had committed to supporting him. And so I ended up volunteering pretty early. So that led me to becoming one of his campaign people here in Virginia. And
Hmm.
so around the time when we were about to win in 2008, my my state delegate at that time, a gentleman named Steve Shannon, decided that he was going to run for attorney general in 2009 in
Hmm.
Virginia. And so he called me one day and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about running for attorney general next year. What do you think?" I said, "Oh, fantastic. You should do it. I'll support you 100%. But I'm really busy right now running the Obama campaign." And he says,
Hmm.
"Well, there's something you can do for me when I run for attorney general." I said, "Yeah, whatever you need, I'll be there for you." He goes, "Why don't you run for my seat?" And I said, "Are you kidding me?" That's not what I expected
Well,
him to
there
say.
you go.
I thought he was going to ask me to do a fundraiser or something. I'm like, "No, are you kidding me? I'm not going to run for office." But he kept on saying, you should, you should. And so eventually, several months afterwards, I finally said, let's at least think about that. And so in 2009, right after 2008 campaign, I ended up running, and then ended up there was a four-way Democratic primary, and then I won that, and then eventually ended up becoming the nominee and won in 2009. That was a year when Governor Bob McDonnell won statewide, and it was a pretty big win for Republicans that year. We lost about
Right.
six Democratic incumbents, so I was
Hmm.
one of the few. In fact, I was the only Democrat who won uh, in a seat that everybody assumed that I was going to lose, and I won by 346 votes, I believe, cast out of about 25,000.
Yeah, well, it's like you said, we all got to participate, and so every single vote counts. And the voters saw something in you, and they really wanted you in office. And it's interesting, just like hearing your story, because and so I'm a second generation Indian American, and so there's this expectation for people of Asian descent that we're normally supposed to just keep our head down, not make too much of a fuss, and don't really rock the boat, so to speak. And yet you're here turning this dynamic on its head. And you're showing people that like you're an immigrant and you can run for office, you can win. Like, can you tell us more about that? What was it like campaigning and running as an immigrant?
Yeah, and you raised a really good point, which I've heard from so many people, not just in the Asian community, but across the board. Those, and especially among our women, who, unfortunately, it's sad to think of women as a whole gender, as a group. But I've heard
Mhm.
it so many times that it does become more of a generalization. But the reality is, there's so many women who have to be asked to think about running, as opposed to just
Sure.
waiting for them to step up and run. Even if you're a white woman, it's so much harder for a white woman to just stand up and say, I want to run for something, as opposed to a man of a male of color, because I think
Sure.
there's more acceptance of males across the board in politics as it is in business than
Hmm.
of women, regardless of our race. But when I first ran, I remember one of my mentors in politics has been Norm Mineta, former secretary, former congressman. He's just an amazing person, inspiring story. But he used to tell the story all the time about how when he was as a second generation or younger generation Japanese American at the time, in as you know, in December 7th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, Japanese Americans were viewed with suspicion, and so February of 1942, then President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which incarcerated 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom U.S. citizens.
Hmm.
Norm's father was one of the people that was incarcerated as a result. Norm and his whole family was sent to, I think, Wyoming. And so by the time he came back from the camp, and his generation, the younger generation, tried to get involved, his parents all said, "Don't get involved. You don't want to stand down." And he used to always say, "A nail that sticks up gets the hammer," right? And so
Yeah.
don't stick your neck out there. But then there were also others who said, you know what? We just went through one of the worst injustices, one of the worst civil rights violations in our history. You rounded up 120,000 innocent people and you put us behind bars. How could we just sit there and say, it's fine, let's take it? No, we have to fight back. And so that sense of resisting the government's injustice is what led to the Japanese Americans that ran for Congress and eventually, changed the laws in America. And so his point to me has always been, you have to speak up. And because there's so
Mm.
many of us in our culture who think, let's not rock the boat, right? Exactly to your point. Just to go become an engineer or go work in a big company. Maybe if you're
Yeah.
smart enough, maybe you can be a doctor. Maybe, maybe if you talk a lot, you can be a lawyer. But other than that, our role is just to kind of be in the sciences, behind the scenes, and just, rock the boat, don't rock the boat. And so for me, I just went, maybe because I wasn't good at anything else, and academically I wasn't meant to be successful in that the field. I thought I reject that. I mean, I reject that completely, because no no change in America, let alone in the world, no major societal changes ever happen with a bunch of compliant people sitting around accepting it, right? Every
Exactly.
single time in history of the world, whenever something major happened, progress is a result of people standing up against and resisting the conformity. And so you have to step up. And I know it's hard. I understand it's very difficult for people of immigrant backgrounds,
Hmm.
especially when they don't want to talk about their private lives or put their families on the, private situations on the line. But in my case, I just, maybe because I grew up with a little bit of a, my father being a public figure himself and having lived overseas and seeing government intervene in such a way with our lives, I just felt it was a little bit more natural for me.
Hmm.
Although one of the difficult things of transitioning from a volunteer to a candidate is, I'd knock on doors and I go to talk to voters and I say,
Hmm.
"Hi, I'm Mark Keam. I'm a volunteer for." No, actually, I'm not a volunteer. I am the candidate. And so, I'd have to
Yeah.
switch my mindset to say, like, "Oh, I want you to vote for this guy. He's a wonderful person." To like, "I want you to vote for me." And that was a little bit hard because I'm I'm not a self-promoting person by nature, but I had to learn to do that. And so just getting used to seeing my name on a billboard or something like that, that was a little bit hard, but you just kind of have to accept that. That's part of the job.
And so what was it, now that you've campaigned and you were introducing yourself to people, what was it like to win in the general election and become the first Asian-born immigrant elected to state office in Virginia? How did that feel to be the first in your own way?
Sure. Well, as much as I've been involved in civil rights and community organizing and especially Asian and immigrant rights efforts, and I've got to know a lot of people in politics, I just didn't think about me being in any way an historic aspect of it. I just didn't see me as anything more than just a footnote. Like, by the way, this guy also ran, at some point. What the moment it became crystallized for me was in, I guess, maybe a couple 3 weeks after the election. So this is late 2009. I received an email from the clerk of the House. It's one of those generic things saying, "Hey, congratulations on winning your election. Now you will be a member of the House of Delegates, and we are going to be updating our website. And so please fill out this questionnaire." So it's one of those online things you type in your name, address, and all
Sure.
that stuff. And it has a bunch of things about, where did you go to school? What are your military experiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the boxes that I'm filling up is online, and it was a pretty standard box, and it said race. And instead of you typing in the information, it was a drop down menu, right? So you click, and so I click it, and the box drops, and it said white and black. And I clicked it again, and I said white and black. I'm like, oh, I don't have a choice here. I can't even type it in.
Yeah.
So I called the gentleman, the clerk, and I said, "Hey, this is Mark Keam. I'm one of the new elected guys." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I know you, Mr. Keam, and welcome," and so on. I said, "Hey, I'm trying to fill out this form that you sent me, and I just wanted to know on this one question, I'm not sure which box am I supposed to check." Now I could have been a jerk about it and just, but I just wanted to be nice about it, be a little diplomatic. So I said, "Could you tell me what I'm supposed to do here?" And he says, "Okay, let me check and get back to you, right?" And then a couple hours later, he's like, "Please try that again." And I went back in, and sure enough, it said white, black, Latino, Asian, other. And it wasn't until that moment that I realized that there had never been anybody who looked like me before who worked in this job. And not just the fact that somebody of my background hadn't run and won, but the fact that the institution never considered it a possibility, because they never even gave us the option of having a drop-down menu with our category on there. And so I did some research. Turns out that we did have some people with Asian heritage, like we've had people with Latino or Hispanic heritage as well. But unfortunately, like Congressman Bobby Scott, who's a great friend of mine, he is a quarter Filipino. In fact, it's our Robert C. Scott. C is for Cortez, which is his Filipino grandfather. When he was in the House and Senate, State Senate, he checked the box of black because he said everybody assumed he was black. Nobody questioned him. He never talked about his Filipino heritage. And we've also had some people with Hispanic heritage, but they were Republicans, and so they just self-identified as white, or at least they didn't self-identify enough to make it an issue. So what's interesting is, and actually you participated with our caucus meetings recently, but when I was first elected, there was a gentleman from Virginia Beach who was a Filipino as well, a Republican. And so the two of us were the first Asians that were elected together. Today, we have at least 5, if not 6, self-identified Asian American state legislators with ancestry in Asia. And so we formed an Asian American caucus within the General Assembly so that we can actually work together beyond just 2 people running into the hallway somewhere. And so in some ways, I'm glad that we're making progress, but in some ways, I'm also disappointed that it took us 400 years to get to that stage.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciate about the story that you told about how you had to politely ask to have, I guess, an Asian box as well, was that I really like how there was also like I think you said it was like a Latino or Latina box as well. So I guess you making a space for yourself also ended up bringing along other people as well. And so you, I guess, being the first also lifted everybody. This sort of rising tide ended up lifting all boats, so to speak.
Yeah,
And I
so
think it's,
back in 1988, when I got involved in my first national campaign, I had one of the most memorable moments in my time in Washington was a meeting that happened at the Democratic National Headquarters between
Mhm,
Michael Dukakis and Reverend Jesse Jackson. And this
mhm,
is Reverend Jesse Jackson's second time running for president. And he ran in '84. Nobody thought he was going to win. But by the time he ran in '88, he became much more credible and more of a legitimate, in terms of the money and the organization and the name ID. And so he became a real threat. And so he started winning primaries. And so Michael Dukakis, who ended up being the last man standing among all the other field,
mhm.
they had to sit down and kind of, do like a little gentleman's agreement about, okay, you're not going to win, I'm going to win, but how do you withdraw, and save face, and what can I do to help you? That meeting happened at the Democratic National Headquarters in the office of Ron Brown, who was at that time the secretary or general counsel of the DNC. And my intern office happened to be right outside that door. So I remember this
Yeah.
meeting happening. And Jesse Jackson used to say, and both at that time and since then, that in America, when one obstacle falls for a group, the doors open for everyone. So
Mhm.
his idea was, he formed this concept at that time, which is pretty bold, the Rainbow Coalition. It's not just about whites versus blacks, but it's about whites versus blacks versus everybody else who's never had a seat, including those that were here originally, Native Americans. And so he
Sure.
built the first real multicultural coalition from a political organizing perspective. And I was very influenced by that, the Rainbow Coalition, and the idea of Rainbow Coalition meaning everybody and not just geographic, but gender and race and demographics, but religion and age, veteran status, disability. Everybody in America who deserves a voice should come together as one America. But you can't do that by saying, oh, everybody's American, we're colorblind. We got to do it by going out of our way to pick and choose people from all those groups so that we can come together in one diversity. And so I really believe in that idea that, it's not just about saying, I mean, as much as I love my community, I couldn't
Mhm.
care less if the government's full of Korean Americans, because that to me is not diversity, just like a government full of whites is not diversity. As much as I want to
Yeah.
see my people, my brothers and sisters being in positions of power, corporations, whatever, it doesn't help me if it's just our people. It has to be about our people as part of others who are also left out. And so coalition building to me is one of the most important aspects of my work.
I really appreciate you saying that, and I really appreciate you bringing up the ideas behind the Rainbow Coalition that you mentioned. And so this younger generation of current middle and high schoolers is probably like the most diverse generation in American history. And going off of what you were saying about the importance of having different voices, making sure different voices have a seat at the table, what would you say to this generation of current middle and high school students to get people to participate and rise up and make sure that they're civically engaged?
Well, so there's a lot has been said about this generation being the most active, the most public-minded, cause and mission-driven, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's all true. But let's not dismiss the fact that we've had young people changing our country's paths for many, many, many generations. In fact, the
Right.
namesake of the John R. Lewis High School, John Lewis himself, was only 23 when he gave that speech at the Washington Mall in April of 1963. And he
Hmm.
was, before that, a high school kid when he first wrote to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and saying, hey, I want to help you with your cause. And so John Lewis, as well as all the freedom riders and those that had their heads beat up and sitting at the lunch counters and all the protests, they were young people who went out of their ways to put their lives on the line to make change happen. That's just one example. If you can go back to generations throughout history, from literally from the beginning of time, we've had young people trying their best to lead older people into doing something that older people felt uncomfortable about. And maybe that's just nature. Maybe it's, as you get older, you become more conservative and a small c conservative, and you become more status quo oriented. You tend
Sure.
to think about retirement. So you don't want to risk anything. You don't want to do something where you're going to, you need to save your money, you need to save your health. And so
Hmm.
generally speaking, as you get older, you're not going to be as willing to take chances. Whereas if you're young, you have a lot less to lose because you've only lived 15 years, and so you want the rest of your life to be something meaningful to you. So I think that's natural. Uh, I'm reminded, in fact, I was speaking about Lewis High School. I'm reminded, I was just at the school last week. In fact, I was looking at this to remind myself. This is the John Lewis High School renaming dedication of ceremony that I was attending last week.
Mhm.
And there were some amazing young people on campus who gave this speech about them becoming John Lewis. There are
Mhm.
several, both I think current students as well as alumni who came and spoke. And even though you had Senator Tim Kaine and a couple of congressmen and others there, none of them were impressive. And no disrespect to my friends in politics, but none of the typical politicians had anything really significant to say. All I can remember is the amazing, powerful words of the young people who spoke on stage about
Mhm.
how this name change from the former Confederate name of that school to what it is now, the first school in our nation to be named after John Lewis, literally the same year that he passed away, untimely passed away. The young voices and what they were demanding as they were becoming activists in the mold of John Lewis is what inspires me to think about how the future is bright. But just
Mhm.
by pure coincidence, I'm not sure if the Lewis High School planned it this way or not. But the event that I was at last week, the rededication ceremony, happened to be April 23rd.
Mhm.
And for those who may not be aware of the significance of April 23rd, April 23 in Virginia is known as the Barbara Johns Day. And the reason
Yes.
is because, as you know, Barbara Johns, who led the protest, students protest against the massive resistance in,
Mhm.
I guess it was 1951, I guess it was, in Moton High School down in Farmville in Prince Edwards. That case, what she did, and it's like the resistance against the resistance. What
Mhm.
she did became one of the 5 lawsuits that were combined into the Brown v. Board of Education. And the fact that Virginia lost and the nation won led to the massive resistance by the Byrd machine. And that
Mhm.
led to the decimation of our public school systems based on racism, which took now 30 or 40 years for us to try to recoup and come back to where we're supposed to be. And the Thomas Jefferson High School in particular, and all the work that you all have been doing as the alumni action group. And I appreciate all the work that you've been doing, especially in the last year on some of the reform ideas that have been done. All of this is based on the fact that young people couldn't stand being discriminated. And
Mhm.
as much as our parents' generation, think about Mr. and Mrs. Johns, Barbara's parents, as much as they were angry and upset at the fact that they were being mistreated, that their kids were being sent to a school that is not only unequal and separate, but just completely second class. And the
Mhm.
fact that they and maybe their parents and their grandparents were slaves or sharecroppers, the fact that they endured so much hardship and discrimination and inhumane treatment, and yet it wasn't the parents that fought against the massive resistance. It was a 16-year-old girl who stood up and said, "This is wrong." And
Mhm.
so that tells you that in every generation, it's the young people that have to be that spark and lead and let the old people like us follow behind them.
That's all incredible. Yeah, thank you for sharing Barbara John's story. And it's really incredible what you were saying about recognizing all the energy and potential in the next generation that's up and coming. And so definitely thank you for putting a spotlight on that. And I just want to be sure that we also talk about your time in the General Assembly as well. And so you've authored more than 100 bills in the General Assembly. Is there like a one or two that you're particularly proud of or that are most meaningful to you?
I think, well, I have no idea if how long I'm doing this. I'm on the ballot again this year, so but this may be the last year if I don't win re-election. But assuming that I have a chance to go back and serve for at least another term or so, I don't know what else I'll be working on. But so far in the last 12 years, I've had the honor of serving in the House. One bill that really comes to mind as something I am personally proud of, but I hope that our Commonwealth is going to be viewed positively as a result of this bill, is the Virginia Environmental Justice Act. I
Mhm.
was the author of that, and it took me a couple of years to pass it, but I passed it last year. And this year, we're going to enhance it and really make it add more teeth and more robust aspects to it, including budget. Unfortunately, it passed the House, but it died in the Senate because some of our colleagues in the Senate, even people of my own political party just didn't see the value of environmental justice. So they ended up gutting the bill to a point where it just wasn't worth us passing it. But the reason why I'm proud of that is because I actually used to practice environmental law straight out of law school. One of my first jobs, I ended up doing some NEPA compliance work and doing a lot of national policy on building out things where we want to make sure we don't, affect fish and wildlife and historic preservation and other endangered species and such. And so I used to practice environmental law years ago, and so I've always had a passion for that. This is back before people had the words climate change as part of the conversation. Back in the 90s, nobody thought about climate change. And so the fact that we are where we are, and speaking of young people, I mean, the Sunrise Movement, the New Deal, the Green New Deal movement, and other conversations, Greta Thunberg and others who really raised the conscience of the world in how we have to make sure we protect our climate from becoming worse and stopping the emission. So environmental justice is an intersection of both environmental protection and conservation, which is the traditional environmental work, as well as the racial inequalities and inequities that we see in every aspect of our life, including systemic
Exactly.
racism. So if you combine those two, the sad and the hot spot there is that you see corporations, profit-driven corporations, putting their most pollutant, most carbon emitting, the most toxic things in those places that are cheapest and those places where there's least resistance among the residents. And that generally happens to be low income, people of color communities. And so environmental justice is a way to flip that on its head to say, not only do we want to bring environmental protection, but we also want to bring social and racial equity to the forefront. So my bill requires as a policy of the Commonwealth to put environmental justice as something that we must do proactively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really appreciate the interdisciplinary lens that you've taken with that, and also in general with just like really looking out for subsequent generations with your work in environmental and also climate legislation, I guess. And so you've been like a leader in Virginia politics for some time, and so what's it like for you to be, I guess, the kind of role model that you said you necessarily like didn't have when, like, for example, when you were doing that first internship in the DNC all those years ago?
Hmm. Well, again, I don't think I ever saw myself as a role model or the person in the lead or anything like that, because I mean, there's no saying that a leader without followers is just a guy going for a walk, right? And so I've
Mm-hmm.
always thought of myself as just one person doing my thing, and I'm just trying to make a difference. I'm happy to follow whoever is leading, but I never saw myself as a leader with a bunch of followers. But if I could do whatever I can to open some doors and others want to walk through, that's great. But to me, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for other people to follow what I'm doing. I'm just looking to make a difference in myself, and if that has an impact of other people doing it, that's fantastic. But I'll tell you a quick story about this because it I do a lot of different work with various different organizations, and one conference I was at, I was on a panel with this African American gentleman. He was in the music industry. He was pretty successful, and he does a lot of entrepreneurship, and he does a lot of mentoring of young African American entrepreneurs
Mm-hmm.
using his network. And he gave this anecdote, which I thought was all really powerful. I've used this a few times. If you're an African American young man and you're home watching TV on a Sunday night, with your family, and everybody has a football game on, and you're watching the game, and when the camera pans to the field and you see just men just roughing it and beating each other over the head, you see the big tough guys, the African American guys, are the running backs, or maybe they're the ones that are just blocking and tackling, and they're the ones that are just really out there aggressively doing amazing work for their team. But when they pan to the quarterback, 99% of the times, quarterback's going to be a white guy. The guy who's calling the shots, the guy who's commanding everything, the guy who's leading everything, the guy who gets the MVP is a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
And once in a while, when there's a touchdown, when the camera pans to the owner's box to see them celebrate, that owner's box is full of white men and their spouses, or maybe some big, corporate donors, or maybe some of their, club members. So you see a bunch of white guys in suits. And then when the camera pans to the sidelines, you see the coach and all of the assistant coaches. Most of them are white.
Mm-hmm.
And so if a young African American is sitting there watching TV and he is told, stay in school, do the best you can, you got a great career ahead of you, you got all kinds of people that want to see you succeed, And yet when he's watching something as simple as a Sunday Night Football, if all he sees are Black people being the blockers and tacklers and the guys that run fast, but the ones that use their brains are the ones that are, quarterbacks or the owners of the teams or the coaches, they don't look like him, then he doesn't know instinctively that that's where he belongs. And so his message was, you got to see it to be it. And it's just the simplest way I can explain how role modeling works, right?
Mm-hmm.
I walked into halls of Congress. I went, running around errands in Washington, D.C. in the 80s. As much as I love the Ted Kennedys of the world, the John Kerrys and all these amazing people that I adored and looked up to, there wasn't a single person that looked like me, except for the laundromat guy or the sandwich shop guy, or maybe the guy who was driving a taxi cab. And so all I saw that I could be was somebody in the background who just, does menial work so that other important people, white men, can do the real big jobs. And so if me being in this job where I can be a member of the House of Delegates, where I can actually serve in elected office, where I can have a gavel, where I'm chairing meetings, which I do as a chair and vice chair, if I can be in front of a group of people where white men are asking me to be on stage with them, where I can actually speak about policy issues that impact all of our lives, it's not whether I'm doing a great job or not. It's not whether I'm, making any difference. It's just the fact that I'm in that environment where people can see that and say, yeah, that Asian looking guy, I don't know what he does or who he is, but at least I know that if I'm a young Asian kid, at least that's a possibility. It's in the realm of possibility of something I can do in my career. And you replicate that by what we just saw last weekend at the Oscars. Instead of seeing the Asian guy as a kung fu guy or the criminal or the bad guy in a movie or a stupid cheap action flick, or an Asian woman as a woman who's the prostitute in a war movie, if they actually saw an Asian woman speaking powerfully about her grandkid, and the Asian guy working in the field trying to farm so that he can feed his kids and working with white people and Black people, that inspires people to say, we could be more than the stereotype. And you take that example and replicate that with Latinos, African Americans, you name it, across the board. I think we really have to see it to be it. And that's why this program that you're doing is so important.
Wow, that is such an incredible answer. And we really appreciate the connections you made to seeing it and being it. And we definitely know that many people who are watching this interview will see you, and you will also have an exponential effect down the road. And so because of you, many people will also grow up to be in a similar position with you, and you'll also inspire many people to go on to really do great things. And so as I just want to shift into kind of like an informal, lighthearted lightning round. And so now we'll have, I'm going to name several words for you, and I'll do this like 4 times. And I just want you to name, just like give me the name that just like that you resonate with or that you most like. So first off, red, yellow, or blue?
Blue.
Running, swimming, or biking?
None of the above. I'm a lousy athlete, but I like bicycles, biking.
Chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry?
Vanilla, plain vanilla.
Car, bus, bike, or train?
I'm a Californian. Car.
Great, well, thank you for that. And so now I believe we have a Kahoot game to transition into. And so this is just an informal game that our audience, some of our audience members will play, just to help like give a little like lighthearted quiz to them, just to make sure that everyone's been following along. And so I just want to turn over to the other panelists who will start it. Okay, here we go. And so this game is going to have some questions based on our conversation just now, and then people will answer, and we'll see how people do. And so right now we're just waiting for players to join. Okay, the Lorax, that's an interesting one. Okay, here we go. And so our first question is going to be, in how many countries did Delegate Keam live before coming to the US? Okay, so about half got this one. How many laws has Delegate Keam authored in the General Assembly? Okay, most people got this one right, 7. Next up, which University of California campus did Delegate Keam attend for undergraduate school? And I definitely hope people were listening very carefully for this one since the answers are very similar. Okay, most people got it, UC Irvine. Next, when was Delegate Keam first elected to the General Assembly? Okay, most people got that one, 2009. And so I believe we have one more question. Which Virginia House district does Delegate Keam represent? '35th, yeah, in the Tyson's Corner, Oakton area. Great, well, congratulations to Ash for coming in first place.
Wow.
Well, yeah.
A lot of fun. I've never seen that before. That's really fun.
Yeah, and so we just wanted to just have a lighthearted way to finish things off. And as we conclude, hope it's okay if I ask you one last question. Do you have intentions on running for higher office someday?
Well, I don't, and the reason is because I never even thought about running for this office until a couple of people asked me to think about it. The way I look at it in politics is certainly there's nothing wrong with being motivated or wanting to do something else, but I think, like in life generally, if you do the best job you can with what you've been given, the responsibilities, the role that you have, then the next job comes along and the promotion comes along. But if you do a horrible job at what you've been given, chances are you're not going to do much more beyond that. So I've always thought, I've been given an amazing role to serve, and so I'm going to do the best I can. And if I can do this well enough, and if some opportunities come along, sure, I'll be happy to look at it. But if I'm thinking about something else, then I'm not focusing on this job. And so I really try not to think about anything other than what I'm doing in front of me.
Well, thank you. And all of us are really grateful to have you in the General Assembly fighting for everyone's interests. And Delegate Mark Keam of the 31st District of Virginia, thank you so very much for your time and sharing your story and really inspiring us all. We really appreciate it.
It was a real honor. I thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who put this together and all the young people out there. Keep up what you're doing, and let us live in the world that you envision for us to live in. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure, I think I may have misspoke earlier. It's the 35th district, and I apologize if I got that wrong. You are representing the 35th district, so thank you. Now, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Akshay, for hosting our interview this evening. And wow, thank you, Delegate Keam, for sharing so many great stories. That feels like an understatement. And reminding us also about the liberties that we enjoy in the United States. Having fast times at Ridgemont High as a cultural touchstone is definitely an interesting immigration experience. First time that that's come up in our series. On a more serious note, thank you for your perspective on the influence of government and how far it reaches. Especially, you made it clear why diversity matters in public service and living the see it, be it example. We need all the options, not just in the drop-down box, but representing everyone in the United States. Some reminders, check out our social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our websites. Email us at info@lewisacademynow.org and email the TJ Alumni Action Group at info@tjaag.org. Our next speaker will be David Ellis, who's the County Manager of Wake County, North Carolina, and that'll be on Thursday, May the 6th. Until then, go in peace, participate, and make good trouble. Good night, everybody.